Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming out this evening for this talk. I was saying to my colleague just before that I feel I should give you all an award for making it to this room. It does feel like a challenging room to get to, but you're here, and we're glad you're here to be with us at this event. I am Matthew Smith. I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery here at UCL. And we are very, very pleased to host this event this evening for you and with you, and share with the experience and expertise of Professor David Lambert, who you will meet very soon, because it's part of one of the things we do at the Centre, which is our public engagement, and a major part of that is having events in which we share a lot of the findings and the work relative to the history of enslavement in Britain and its former empire with a wider public, and to exchange and engage in that. There's going to be a lot that you'll learn from tonight, and I'm positive that many ideas will be sparked as you hear Professor Lambert's talk. And I also am very confident to say that the only sparks will be the ideas. There will be no naked flames in this room this evening. But as one of the department's designated fire marshals, I am obliged to tell you that in the off chance that I am wrong, which I promise you I will not be, there are exits right behind us, the same room that we entered. There's an exit here as well. And you could calmly file singly to the nearest staircase to exit the building proper. That's not going to happen. Instead, we'll have many more moments of great learning and enjoyment indeed this evening. I want to say something very briefly about the Centre before we get going. And for those of you who don't know much about the Centre, please, I do invite you to visit our website there on the screen and learn more, and also to register for our mailing list, where you'd also get, in addition to updates of events such as this one this evening, our newsletter, Traces, which we publish quarterly. The Centre began out of a project that started in 2009, or thereabouts, led by Catherine Hall, the chair of the Centre, who is unfortunately not with us this evening, who sends her regrets to all of us. Keith McClellan, one of the founders who's in the room this evening, scratching his head as I speak, and Nicholas Draper. And that project was the very well-known Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, which looked at the compensation monies that were paid to enslavers at the time of British abolition in the 1830s. So it's a remarkable project. We've had well over 3 million visitors, unique visitors, I would say, to our database, which has spawned many research projects, creative projects, film and media projects, and so on, and still is developing. One of the things we find of great interest to us at the Centre is that even though the database has been live and accessible for the past decade, we still find people using it and engaging with us very deeply with that data in new ways, and ways that also sort of are stitched into larger national questions around legacies of slavery here in Britain and internationally today. A lot of our work currently takes and builds from that work that I've just described in ways that center the lives of enslaved persons much more centrally in how we talk about legacies of enslavement and how we understand the wide and global impact of that on Africans, Creoles, and their descendants, both in the Caribbean and here in Britain. And the lecture series that you are all here to share with us in this evening is very much in keeping with that idea. This is a series that we started last year. It's our second annual lecture, and we decided to name it appropriately in honor of Elsa Goveia. Now, Elsa Goveia might be an unfamiliar person to several of us in the room, but Elsa Goveia is a very important figure in understanding the development of the writing, teaching, and indeed the broader knowledge of Caribbean history. Elsa Goveia is a Guyanese historian who was excelled as a student in Guyana and came to University College London on a scholarship in the 1940s, which I should say, she did all of her studies. So here is a pioneer in the development of the teaching of Caribbean history, a pioneer in the development of the writing of Caribbean historiography, who developed her first interest in that discipline right here. And in fact, just to give you a sense of how much of a pioneer I'm speaking of, when she came to UCL, it wasn't to read for a history degree in Caribbean history because that didn't exist. There were no modules or courses on the Caribbean. It was to read for a degree in English history. And by her second year in her undergraduate degree program, Elsa Goveia won the Pollard Prize for Best Essay in the history of England, or in English history. So a very significant achievement for a young woman coming from British colony at the time. And then she went on from there to do her master's, to enroll to do her master's at UCL. And after her first term, the department tutor for the MA program wrote a letter, and thanks to a student in the front row, Nayo Okeke, who did some research on Elsa Goveia's student years at UCL, we found that letter. And in the letter, the tutor wrote, "The quality of this work far exceeds the level that she's at. We recommend her to be transferred immediately to a doctoral doctoral program." So she went immediately into her PhD program, and she chose not to study English history then, which she had already proven herself more than skilled at doing, but to study the history of the Caribbean, and particularly the history of enslaved societies in the Caribbean. And that became the foundation of her dissertation work she would eventually file in 1951 at UCL. Now, the very last year, when she was doing her final write-up for her PhD, she applied for a job that was advertised through various newsletters at the time. It was a job for a historian in the newly developed Department of History at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus in Jamaica. And it was a job explicitly for a historian in Caribbean history. That was what she applied for. It was the first time that post had been created. It was the head of the department had just took up position, John Parry, in 1949, and he wanted that the first position that was hired would be a position in Caribbean history, knowing the importance of Caribbean history teaching for the Caribbean region. She applied for the job, she got the job, and she would spend her entire professional career as a historian at the University of the West Indies from 1951 straight until her passing in 1980. And it was during that time that Elsa Goveia would publish her major works on slave societies in the Leeward Islands, a remarkable book, which was a very interesting book to publish early in her career, on the historiography of the British Caribbean. And also, in addition to that work, being a staunch activist and supporter of West Indian Federation, anti-apartheid, the teaching of teachers in the Caribbean. That was a major aspect of her work, and one of the things we've been able to trace is that in her very first decade as a lecturer at the university, she was constantly giving lectures in high schools and all over, knowing that she'd be teaching Caribbean students. And I think one very clever teaching teachers who would teach Caribbean students, and one very clever and important sort of highlight of just how far her impact would reach. Walter Rodney himself, an esteemed historian from Guyana, famously talked about being a high school student and taking notes from his teacher's notebook, who had been taught by Elsa Goveia in Jamaica. So you see how much this is all very much connected. The University of the West Indies, Mona Department of History and Archaeology, has done a wonderful tribute to Elsa Goveia. That's the URL on YouTube. You can easily find it if you go on YouTube and just Google Elsa Goveia, and you will learn a lot more about her life and career and her works. So the lecture series that we are now about to hear from with Professor Lambert is done in the spirit of Elsa Goveia's work. It's in the spirit of ensuring that how we understand, discuss, and relate to the history of British slavery and its long legacies is done in a way that is mindful of the whole society, all the various elements of that society. And I think it's appropriate to close with the final paragraphs of Elsa Goveia's PhD dissertation, which she filed in 1951. And this was written 71 years ago, and I think you will find that many of her sentiments here we could almost hear and say today. Quote, "Modern writers of the British West Indies have laid most emphasis on the political and economic history of these colonies, and particularly upon activities of their white inhabitants. Insofar as the slaves have attracted the attention of these writers, they have been treated chiefly as the economic agents more or less inefficient in the production of sugar and wealth. Definitive study of the free-colored elements of the population has been equally neglected. Yet the study of these diverse groups, of their social relationship, and of the forces which held them together as parts of the single entity which was their society cannot be neglected in the history of the West Indies if it is to be reconstructed without serious distortion." End quote. So this is very much the mission of the work we do at the Centre. It's also a mission that I believe confidently and strongly that Professor Lambert shares in his work, which you'll shortly hear about. And so I am very pleased to welcome you. I'm very pleased to host him here at UCL, and I look forward to a great lecture and great evening. I'm now going to invite Isaac Critchlow, who is a PhD student at our Centre and in the History Department, to do the formal introduction of Professor Lambert. Isaac?
Hello, everybody. I've been given the honour of introducing Professor Lambert, our highly esteemed speaker for this second Elsa Goveia lecture. Before I speak a little bit about his work, I would like first to introduce myself. My name is Isaac Critchlow, and I am second year PhD candidate attached to the Centre, as Matthew just said. And I'm studying the West India Regiments. The working title of my thesis is Black Regiments and Resistance, Movement, Control and Freedom. As such, I can tell you with some confidence that I am the most excited in this room to hear what Professor Lambert is about to say. David Lambert is Professor of Caribbean History and Director of the Yesu Persuad Centre for Caribbean Studies at the University of Warwick. He is Associate Editor of the journal Slavery Abolition, Fellow of both the Royal Geographical and Royal Historical Associations, and most recently the Principal Investigator in the AHRC-funded project entitled Africa's Sons Under Arms. Professor Lambert has developed the research from that project into a forthcoming book, which will be titled Of Uncertain Rank, The West India Regiments in British Imperial Culture, of which I'm sure we'll hear more about shortly. Professor Lambert has produced many other notable titles, including White Creole Culture, Politics and Identity During the Age of Abolition, published in 2005, Colonial Lives Across the British Empire, published in 2006, and Mastering the Niger, published in 2013. And this range of titles covers topics from white Creole culture in the Caribbean to imperial networks and imperial careers. He is drawn on interdisciplinary approaches, including the practices of geography, sociology, and post-colonial studies to create these highly acclaimed studies. Professor Lambert's excellent scholarly career supports his achievements in teaching. Currently on offer at the University of Warwick are two undergraduate modules led by Professor Lambert entitled Freedom Fighting, Race, Slavery and War in the Revolutionary Caribbean and Statues Must Fall, Remembering and Forgetting Slavery in the Atlantic World. I cannot overstate the importance of these courses for continuing to invigorate young people, inspire them and get them interested in and interacting with histories of enslavement. When I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Glasgow, there were no courses on offer which dealt with slavery. And the only mention of it in lectures was in a module covering North American history. And that mimicked my experience at secondary school as well. That lack of attention is something that needs to change. And the picture is gradually improving, thanks largely to the efforts of historians like Elsa Goveia, who Matthew just told us about, Matthew Smith himself, and Professor David Lambert, sat here next to me. So without any further ado, I would like you all to join me in welcoming Professor David Lambert to deliver the Elsa Goveia lecture.
So, thanks, Isaac, for those words. Very kind of you, although I prefer to hear about Elsa Goveia. It's embarrassing to hear about it myself, but I really appreciate that. Thank you very much to Matt for the invitation to give this talk. It's a real honour to do so, both because of the importance of Elsa Goveia within the historiography of the Caribbean, but also the ongoing work of the LBS. I mean, you guys here have continuing to shape not just kind of our understanding of history, but public discourse about how you think about the relationship between not just the importance of slavery, but the relationship between the past and the present. So, in this lecture, I am going to talk about the Caribbean, obviously. I'm going to have a lot to say about the Caribbean. I'm also going to range slightly beyond that. And I'm going to start with this. So, in 2018, the National Army Museum in London acquired a really remarkable painting. Dating from the early years of the 19th century, its creator unknown, it depicts a private of the 8th West India Regiment. Now, the soldier was a member of the regiment's light company, as indicated by the green plume on his black stovepipe shako headgear. Supposedly consisting of the smallest and quickest men, they were often used to scout, skirmish, and operate in looser formations. The private stands to attention in the course of presenting arms, as though he's in the middle of performing a drill, under the inspection of an unseen superior. And of course, we, the viewer, are in that kind of role. We're inspecting him. Tents and other uniformed figures can be seen to the soldier's rear, as well as a coastline with sailing vessels. And on the right-hand side, get used to these, we're going to see a lot of palm trees. And I think that's important. The palm trees are significant. That denotes that this is the Caribbean. Now, the depiction of British Army personnel from the period of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, including ordinary rank and file, was not uncommon. But of course, what is the ethnicity of the soldier. The West India Regiments were established by Britain in the Caribbean from the mid-1790s as part of the regular army and uniformed as such. So these are not colonial auxiliaries. It's really important to stress that. Consolidating some existing units, their numbers were greatly augmented through the conscription of enslaved African men purchased by the British Army in the late 1790s and early 1800s. Now, originally, the 8th West India Regiment had been raised in 1795, and in April 1802, most of its soldiers, based at Fort Shirley in the north of Dominica, mutinied, rising up, killing some of their white officers, and the British termed this a mutiny. This event was suppressed within a matter of days by a force of white Britons, leaving around 100 West India Regiment soldiers dead. Subsequent inquiries revealed that the men of the 8th West India Regiment, based at Fort Shirley, had been embezzled of their pay and used by their commanding officer, Andrew James Cochrane Johnston, who was also the governor of Dominica, to work land that he owned near to the fort in preparation for the planting of sugarcane. Such treatment, combined with rumours that the regiment was to be disbanded during the period of peace associated with the Treaty of Amiens, and the men were to be re-enslaved, were the causes of the uprising. Now, in the aftermath of these events, the 8th West India Regiment was reduced. That is, most of its remaining soldiers were reclassified as pioneers and sent to perform hard labour for white regiments elsewhere in the Caribbean region. And other soldiers who were not deemed to be involved were transferred to other West India regiments. Meanwhile, the renumbering of the remaining regiments saw the old 11th West India Regiment become the new 8th West India Regiment towards the end of 1802. Now, it's unclear whether this oil painting is an old 8th West India Regiment soldier or a new 8th West India Regiment soldier. Either way, although we don't know his identity, this is a naturalistic portrait of an individual man, probably based on the direct experience of a regimental officer. He's presented as a soldier, carrying his weapons and in a military setting. And moreover, representing one of the earliest known visual depictions of the West India Regiments, though one that wasn't reproduced in printed form, this painting is emblematic of a discourse that emerged around the creation of these particular military units. More than 100 years later, quite a different image of a West India Regiment soldier was printed in the Boy's Own paper. The Boy's Own paper is a fairly typical kind of late Victorian, Edwardian sort of newspaper aimed at basically boys, sport, exploration, war, daring do's, empire, that's the kind of stuff. Now, by this point, by the early 20th century, there's only one West India Regiment remaining in existence. And in striking contrast with the early 19th century painting, the private, just there, is portrayed not wearing the uniform of Britain's line regiments, but a wholly different type based on that of France's Zouave soldiers. And I'll come back to that. Another difference, of course, between the images is that this later one, the soldier does not stand alone, but rather accompanied by 29 other military figures, 11 of them mounted. And this was a body of men drawn from across the British Empire, including representatives of the Indian Army, as well as soldiers from Australia and Canada. Now, these types of collective martial images are becoming increasingly common by the end of the 19th century, and they're part of a kind of the emergence of a wider mass militarized culture with like collectible cards, toy soldiers, public pageants. There's a whole kind of wider militarized culture here. Now, while this multiracial grouping sought to articulate a sort of an idea of imperial fraternity, an idea of unity and diversity, a kind of a positive spin on the hierarchies of empire, by including a representative of the West India Regiment among these empire's defenders, the print is actually performing a visual sleight of hand. This is because, as I've said, the West India Regiment soldiers were part of the regular British Army. They were not colonial forces like the Trinidad Light Infantry or the Victoria Rangers, for example. The West India Regiment soldier does not belong in this company. Yet his presence here not only exemplifies the increasing marginalisation of the West India Regiments in British imperial culture in the second half of the 19th century especially, but also a deep ambiguity about their military, and connected to that, their kind of racial status that was evident from the start. Now, despite these differences, there are similarities between the images. The former can be located within a longer-standing kind of proto-ethnographic tradition of how indigenous and non-white people were represented, which had changed little since the Renaissance. So, for example, the figure stands with body and weapons posed for display on a shallow foreground, while other figures in the landscape echo the main subject and lend a sense of scale. Likewise, the title for the later image, Types of Our Empire's Defenders, evoked an anthropological perspective on difference. Both privates also stand in a formal pose as though ready for inspection rather than action. And indeed, I'll go on to argue that the image of the West India Regiment soldiers as kind of curiously passive military figures with a martial value that had to be sort of continually evaluated and assessed is a recurrent feature of their visual and textual representation, and I would argue something that had real consequences not only for how they were viewed, but also how they were used. So in this lecture then, I want to talk about the changing image of the West India Regiment soldiers over the historical period bookended by these two images. Prior to the formal abolition of the British trade in enslaved African men, women and children in 1807, the bulk of recruits were enslaved African men and boys. Subsequently, so-called liberated Africans, captured by the Royal Navy, would become a new source of soldiers. Owing both to their origins in slavery and with a rank and file overwhelmingly composed of men of African descent, the regiments have held a unique place in the British Army. Commanded by white officers, they could be seen to represent, for some, a kind of idealization of the racial hierarchies. And there's a lot of kind of, they're often described in a very paternalistic kind of way. At the same time, the West India Regiment's men did enjoy at least close equality with other soldiers in the British regiments, not least as encapsulated by the uniform itself. They also, of course, had a series of complex relations, to put it mildly, and this is what Isaac's work is on, with other people of African descent in the places where they served. As such, the West India Regiments held an uncertain place at the nexus of a whole series of debates about, for example, racial difference, about slavery and freedom, about savagery and civilization, about military heroism and duty. So I'm going to say a little bit about the origins of the West India Regiments, and I should say there's not going to be much of this, but some of the things I'm quoting are language of the late 18th century, including the language used to describe racial difference. So in April 1795, Britain's Secretary for War, Henry Dundas, authorised the raising of what he called 2 corps of mulattoes or Negroes, of 1,000 rank and file each. The original request had come from Lieutenant General Sir John Vaughan, who had taken over all military command in the Caribbean in October 1794. And Vaughan was convinced that Britain's military fortunes in the region could only be improved by tapping new sources of military personnel. So Vaughan wrote, "I have always thought that the climate of the West Indies, the mountainous country of which most of the islands are formed, and in particular the number of blacks which are to be kept in order, required the adoption of some plan from which we could avail ourselves of the service of the Negroes. The example of the sepoys in the East Indies is strong proof of what is capable of being effected by troops of this nature," by which he means non-white troops. He went on, "I am of the opinion that a corps of 1,000 men, commanded by British officers, would render more essential service in this country than treble the number of Europeans who are unaccustomed to the climate. And as the enemy has adopted this measure to recruit their armies, I think we should pursue a similar plan to meet them on equal terms." And by the enemy, of course, he meant revolutionary France. So the impetus for the establishment of the West India Regiments arose not only from the hazard that the environment posed to the health of white troops, or indeed the successful precedent represented by the East India Company's use of sepoys. It was also fundamentally a response to the abolition of slavery in the French Caribbean in early 1794, which left the British both as the primary defenders of slavery and increasingly on the military defensive. In other words, the raising of the West India Regiments was a desperate, and I'll use that word a lot, a desperate response to a realignment of the boundaries between slavery and freedom and the military consequences of this in the Caribbean. Now, the creation of the West India Regiments was part of a longer history entwining military service and slavery, both in the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world. But while it is true that men of African descent, both free and enslaved, had previously been used in both military and pioneering roles, this is well established not only in the British Empire but in other European empires by the late 18th century. Nonetheless, I don't think we should underestimate the novelty of this, the significance of this change. The establishment of West India Regiments as permanent military units, whose mainly soldiers of African descent were armed, paid, rationed, and, until 1858, uniformed along European lines, that were part of the British Army and that were under the control of the War Office, I think this is pretty significant and we shouldn't underestimate that. During their existence of more than 130 years, West India Regiment soldiers served across the Caribbean, including in what's now Belize and Guyana. They also participated in the War of 1812. And from the 1820s, they were also posted and served in West Africa in Sierra Leone, what's now Ghana, parts of Nigeria. Numbering 12 at their peak, only a single regiment comprising of 2 battalions remained after 1888. And this final regiment was disbanded in 1927. Throughout this history, the martial capabilities of the West India Regiments was continually questioned. In the most extreme form in the early years, this was expressed in intense opposition to their very existence, particularly from white colonists. And although such sentiment did recede, even decades later, there were many, including senior military figures, who continued to express skepticism about the military value of the regiments. Writing in the 1880s, Alfred Burden Ellis, who was a senior West India Regiment officer and the author of the first official history of these units, described their service in terms of unknown and forgotten skirmishes. And he decried how little public understanding there was of the history and nature of the regiments. And what he argued, and I would completely agree with Ellis, is that this lack of public understanding in the British public of these regiments isn't just a kind of lack of knowledge. It's not that they didn't simply know. It's something more fundamental to do with the fact that this group was in these men were seen as not fitting in with a set of racial hierarchies, which particularly intensified towards the end of the 19th century. Now, the uncertainty and marginalisation that I think are characteristic of the history of the West India Regiments is illustrated by these sorts of images. And more generally, I want to talk about how such patterns of marginalisation and uncertainty are evident both in visual and textual discourses that surround the West India Regiments over the long 19th century, as representations of them are circulated across wider imperial culture, as efforts are made to manage this image, and the consequences of all this for how they were used in military terms. Now, a concept that I found very useful in thinking about these themes is Scott Miley's notion of military spectacle. That was a book that was published in 1996, and I don't think it's had the impact it should have had, basically because I think it was published almost like sort of 5 to 10 years too early, before kind of military historians or people interested in military affairs were beginning to think kind of culturally. And I think if it had come out later, Miley's work would be really, really important. And I still think it is. So Miley uses the term military spectacle to refer to the distinctive clothing, equipment, badges, flags and standards, as well as the music, ceremonies, rituals, forms of address, and bodily deportment associated with the military. These elements were experienced by soldiers every day, and Miley argues that the manipulation of military spectacle was a crucial element in managing army discipline and morale, as well as in facilitating recruitment. Military spectacle, particularly the uniform, of course, served to mark the soldier off from the wider population. It was brought to public attention through drilling, through military reviews and pageants, as well as being represented in a range of visual forms. Military spectacle exerted a strong psychological and emotional influence on the soldiers themselves, Miley argued, as well as shaped how they were viewed by others. Now, the military spectacle of the West India Regiments was a focus for a range of projects, discourses, interventions that were directed towards the soldiers themselves, and as such were a key part of their fashioning into martial subjects. So take, for example, the original decision to adorn the men in what was essentially the military spectacle of the foot regiments that made up the bulk of the British Army. There were some suggestions that the regiments should be raised as kind of light infantry and uniformed as such, but this choice was deemed important because it seemed, at least figuratively, to represent equality with other regiments. That's the idea. As well as between white and black soldiers within the regiments. So early on, there are some white soldiers, particularly non-commissioned officers. And more generally, some kind of figurative equality between white and black soldiers across the British Army. And it's important to understand this as part of a calculation by the British military authorities in the late 18th century, by which they sought to secure the loyalty, or at least the compliance, of soldiers of African descent to their cause in the face of a far wider and more significant range of freedoms that had been offered to, and more importantly, seized by people of African descent elsewhere in the Caribbean. So, this is where the Haitian Revolution is taking place. These soldiers are raised. The creation of the West India Regiments, I want to stress, needs to be understood as an act of desperation, as Britain saw its armed forces beaten back by the multi-ethnic revolutionary alliances associated with the Haitian and French revolutions, including insurgencies across the wider Caribbean, all while being crippled by sickness. In this context, this kind of military spectacle is as radical an image as it is possible to imagine a pro-slavery counter-revolutionary force creating in this context. It was a spectacular and symbolic gift in the lieu of more substantive freedoms. Now, the question of whether the men internalised this British military discipline is a significant one, even though the perspective of the soldiers themselves is almost impossible to access. Too often we have opinions allotted to them, especially by their officers, such that while military subalterns and their superior officers speak freely, the ordinary soldiers' views remain private. But archival silence does not mean passivity. Writing more widely of military service, Eric Jan Zerker insists that soldiers have agency, with a life in the army offering opportunities for social advancement or material betterment, escape from what he calls issues at home, or the chance to travel beyond one's immediate locale. Now, while such forms of agency may not have been available to West India Regiment soldiers, not least because of how they were bought to serve in the British Army, the soldiers were certainly not passive. And it is, I think, very significant that the first mutiny among soldiers from the West India Regiments that I mentioned before occurred amid rumours that the soldiers were to be disarmed and sold into slavery. That many of the men had already been deployed with hoes and machetes, and that to clear land near where their base, and the fact that the pay they should have been receiving for this additional work was erratic, only lends credence to such fears. In the context then of an apparent threat to their military status, which is central to their freedom, the men took action. But such mutinies were the exception, and the broader success of army discipline, the power exerted by military spectacle, was evident in the fact that the West India regiments largely did their duty in soldiering, dying, and killing for the British Empire. Now, the military spectacle of the West India regiments was also, of course, intended to send a message about how they should be viewed by others, and this took on considerable significance in the societies where they served. Military uniform and other martial symbols differentiate soldiers from the civilian population, as well as express identity with comrades. And when the soldiers in question were of African descent, in societies characterized by stark racial hierarchies, and where the large majority of people of African descent were enslaved, the West India Regiment soldier could be seen as a deeply threatening figure for white colonists. So take, for example, the comments of John Stewart, longtime resident of the island of Jamaica, who wrote in the early 19th century, the revulsion in Jamaica at the sight of British military deserters being transferred to Up Park Camp. He wrote, "When a detachment of black soldiers was seen guarding and conveying some white deserters, pinioned and in a miserable sight to headquarters, it was regarded by the inhabitants," he means the white inhabitants, "as a novel and revolting sight, though if white soldiers had guarded the delinquents, it would have excited no sensation." What made this a novel and revolting sight was that these white deserters, who had been amongst the thousands sent out to the Caribbean during the war with France, were being guarded by men from the 2nd West India Regiment. Stewart's comments reveal a deep concern with the apparent threat posed to the established racial order by West India Regiment personnel. Now, of course, the sight of people of African descent being conveyed in a miserable plight would have been common in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean at this time, and they were frequently pinioned and otherwise constrained. But it's the racial inversion of this pattern of bodily restraint and forced mobility that made this scene revolting, provoking deep disquiet or even disgust for white colonists like Stewart. And I think the emphasis he played on the sight of this occurrence is also significant. It wasn't just the presence of black soldiers that was seen as problematic, but the existence, but it was their presence in society, the fact that they could be seen. And it was even argued that their very sight might be a kind of revolutionary impulse amongst enslaved people. Far from being a source of reassurance for men like Stewart, the military spectacle of the West India regiments was disquieting and dangerous. Along with raising doubts about the extent to which the men had internalised their martial role, critics like Stewart made frequent calls for the black soldiers to be confined to remote military locations, to lessen the threat they might pose almost to the visual regime of slavery. Keep them out of sight. Now, in the course of seeking to win support for the creation and continuing value of the West India regiments, as well as attempting to garner some acceptance among colonists, a particular image of their rank and file was articulated, and I term this particular image the steady black soldier as a trope, the steady black soldier. This figure was fashioned through performative and representational acts undertaken by supporters of the regiments and some of those that commanded them. The steady black soldier was produced through practices and spaces associated with military seasoning, drilling and disciplining, as well as calculated public acts designed to win over a sceptical, often hostile white West Indian public. The embodied military spectacle of the West India Regiment soldier on parade in the landscape was at the heart of the production of this steady black soldier, their disciplined nature evident in their uniform and bearing. But this image was also expressed in word and in visual images of a remarkably consistent nature. So I've kind of shown you some of these already. this kind of image, and even in its early 20th century Zouave form, this sort of thing, and this is probably the earliest, this is certainly the earliest image I found that was reproduced of a West India Regiment soldier. This is from 1803, I think. And this is a detail from a much larger image which includes other, obviously, non-West India Regiment soldiers as well. There are certain features that keep recurring here. The first one, and I think if we think about the visual depiction of this kind of steady black soldier, it helps to clarify the sort of the trope I'm describing. The first feature was their tropicality, their tropical otherness. I meant what I said about those palm trees. They are always there. And in some ways you might think, well, that's just a feature of the landscape. What's remarkable about this one is that there aren't any other landscape features in the rest of the image, apart from some vague hills and a couple of tents, but we have a palm tree. There's something there. And of course, although these soldiers are recognisably British infantrymen by the virtue of their uniform, the viewer is always reminded of where the soldiers came from and why they were employed in the Caribbean. After all, as my colleague Tim Lockley has talked about, it was the supposedly lesser vulnerability to tropical environments, understood in thoroughly racialised terms, that provided a key military rationale for their use. The second feature is passivity. West India Regiment soldiers are always portrayed as well turned out and disciplined, but they are seldom, barely ever shown even moving, never mind fighting. I mean, literally, of the dozens of images that, if you look the whole visual archive across the long 19th century, I can think of maybe 3 where they're actually doing anything other than just standing there in this kind of style. There seemed to be a deep reluctance, maybe even an unease with depicting these men in action. And this brings me to the third feature of this visual discourse, which is the soldiers are presented as what I would describe as ready for inspection. Now, whilst partly a reflection of the novelty of the regiments, the fact that the majority of the British public would have been unfamiliar with them, given where they served, there is, I think, much more than this. This type of image made the visual case for the value of the West India Regiments, but it's based on, of course, presenting them as a disciplined, kind of reliable force. But that kind of military value is never demonstrated. It's just we are invited to confirm it by looking at them. We're always being invited to inspect these men. And I should say that if I could show you other images from, other images, sort of contemporaneous images of ordinary soldiers, including non-white soldiers. East India Company sepoys don't get portrayed this way, which is interesting. This idea that they're kind of presented to us in a way where we have to assess them is a really characteristic feature. Now, the steady black soldier is, of course, produced in the context of and in relationship with a whole series of other images of people of African descent in the circulating in this period. This is from Brian Edwards' History, an image of a Jamaican maroon from 1795. Clearly a very sort of different representation of martial blackness, if I can put it that way. And likewise images of the kind of of Haitian revolutionaries or of other figures that the British at the time called brigands and banditti, was the general term they used to refer to everyone they're fighting, basically, are portrayed in a very different way. But of course there's also other sets of images that are also in circulation at exactly the same time too. And I think images associated obviously with the British anti-slavery movement. And Catherine Hall talks about the kind of place of these kind of images within what she called the war of representation. The war of representation that was kind of fought in the late 18th and into the early 19th century over the image of people of African descent. Now, when we think about a war of representation and we think about soldiers, obviously that takes on an additional charge. And I think that when we talk about the war of representation fought over the image of people of African descent, these military figures need to be placed in that context too. So my argument is that at the same time that pro and anti-slavery representations of people of African descent are in circulation, so too are these military ones. And these sorts of images, of course, are associated not with the abolitionist movement, but with military personnel particularly. And indeed, when we think about the creation of the West India Regiments in the late 18th century, which I talked about before, I think it's important not only to consider the establishment of the regiments as a kind of administrative, logistical, bureaucratic military act, but also we need to think about it as a kind of cultural and symbolic act, a way of trying to establish that this is a good idea, that arming men of African descent is a good thing to do. And that's what these kind of images are making a case for. And in so doing, the proponents of the regiments were seeking to overturn certain stereotypes in circulation. One would be about the idea that the enslaved people of African descent were childlike and therefore couldn't fight. The other one is that they're too savage and therefore they can't be trusted to fight. So what the proponents of the regiments are doing is seeking to sort of challenge those stereotypes and create something new. But just as the abolitionist movement was also seeking to overturn negative images of black people and ended up creating a whole bunch of new ones, the idea of the passive victim, grateful, wanting to be helped rather than freeing themselves. Likewise, these images, this steady black soldier image is the kind of I would argue, it's the martial equivalent of the Wedgwood cameo. It is a figure trapped in passivity. It makes an appeal to the viewer rather than being a confident assertion of equality and value. The military spectacle of the West India Regiments over the course of the long 19th century was characterised both by continuity and change. In April 1859, the Illustrated London News carried the first account of the new picturesque uniform that had been issued to Britain's 3 remaining regiments a year earlier. It described them as, quote, similar to that of the French Zouaves with a few alterations, the contrast of colour being decidedly better. They have the fez cap with large white turban and white tassel at the side, white flannel jacket ornamented in front with yellow braid and brass buttons. Over this is a scarlet waistcoat edged with yellow braid, also ornamented dark blue doublets with 2 yellow stripes on either side, yellow leather leggings and sandals complete the dress. And the paper carried this, the first visual depiction of the new uniform, featuring 2 unnamed corporals from the 1st West India Regiment. Now, putting the novelty of the dress to one side, this, of course, is yet another image of the steady black soldier. It's another one of these types of images, complete with palm trees. The article assured its readers that these are intelligent and well-educated men seeking to preempt assumptions to the contrary, whilst, of course, simultaneously acknowledging that such views exist. As I said, the tropical setting is unsurprising until one reads in the accompanying article that the image was taken from life among half a dozen men who were in Britain at the Hythe School of Musketry in Kent for weapons training. I haven't been to Kent for a while, but I don't think there are palm trees. Well, there probably weren't palm trees in the mid-19th century anyway. In other words, the image removes the men from the British metropolitan landscape in which they were actually observed and sends them back to the Caribbean. As highlighted by the Illustrated London News, one of the notable features of the new pattern uniform was its colouring. So this lithograph from the early 1860s draws particular attention to the scarlet waistcoat, the blue pantaloons, and the yellow trimmings. And again, we have another image of the kind of steady black soldier, the posture, positioning of the viewer in relation to the main figure and the tropical setting. But there are a couple of other things that are very interesting about why I think this is an important image, a very revealing image. The first is the figure here, which is a sergeant and a bandsman. Now, there was a long tradition before the late 18th century of having often ornately dressed men of African descent as drummers and cymbalists in many British units. So there is a kind of, I think the image is evoking that longer, older tradition of kind of this exotic black presence within the British Army. The second thing is that the uniforms of the officers over here show that there was no Zouavization of the white officers. And in fact, the instructions when this new pattern uniform was issued are explicit that the white officers would not wear any kind of equivalent uniform. They instead would wear the dress of the kind of what standard officers would wear under tropical service. So there's an explicit, it's only the NCOs and below, who by this point are basically of African descent, who will, or overwhelmingly of African descent, who would wear this new uniform. So overall then, while these figures share many similarities with those they do share many similarities with those from the first half of the 19th century, they also embody this new kind of exotic martial spectacle. So as I noted before, when Britain first established the regiments, they were attired along the same lines of the foot regiments that form the bulk of the army. And it's in this style that they serve in the Caribbean and later in West Africa. But then we see this dramatic change in the late 1850s to a pattern often described as Moorish or Oriental. And the inspiration for this is the uniform of the French Zouave forces. Now, I can say a bit more about this if people want, but by the 1850s, late 1850s, France's Zouave forces are seen, there's a kind of, there's almost like a cult around them. People are dressing up as them at balls. They're seen as like, they're renowned for both their kind of, their exotic look, but also for their élan. And it's worth saying that the Zouave units by the mid-19th century in the French army are made up of white Frenchmen. These are not African soldiers or North African soldiers. And there's a lot of kind of, there's a sort of almost a desire to emulate that. I mean, this is a plan for the West India Regiment uniform, and it's very explicit what it's drawing on, very clear. The shift in the military spectacle of the West India Regiments then was a pivotal moment in their changing image. It stemmed both from a British desire to emulate martial prowess, which had taken, the British had taken a reputation for military success, had taken something of a beating during the Crimean War, whereas the French army had seen to have been successful in the Crimean War, as well as reformist efforts within the British Army. It also reflected new ideas about non-European cultures, including in the Caribbean. So this is also the same time when we see the emergence of kind of proto-touristic, Orientalist type discourse being used in the Caribbean to sort of describe the Caribbean and its non-white peoples. Moreover, the change also represented a return to older ideas about martial blackness, of which I think this evokes, but of course also was connected to new ideas that are becoming increasingly entrenched around racial difference from the mid-19th century onwards. Those who called for the change in the dress of the West India Regiments drew on increasingly prominent ideas about the supposedly unchanging nature of their black personnel, who were deemed to be kind of somehow naturally savage warriors who should be unencumbered by the trappings of civilized soldiering. So there's a hell of a lot of debate at this time about what sort of footwear the West India Regiment soldiers should be wearing. You know, can African men wear boots is basically, and that's really seen as very significant. That comes down to some fundamental debates at the time around basically racial difference. It's also, of course, ironic that these kind of views are being expressed at a time when the units were increasingly made up of Creole African Caribbean men, primarily from Jamaica and Barbados. And this is just a reminder that these kind of sentiments were far more to do with kind of wider discourse around race than the actual composition of the units. So if the original uniform encapsulated a kind of paternalistic desire to civilize African bodies through military service, then part of the impetus for this change was a belief that that goal had been misplaced. If the original military spectacle was an idealized representation of the establishment and disciplining of West India Regiment units, a process I think that can be seen as paralleling anti-slavery hopes for kind of civilizing through freedom, then the Zouavization of the regiments from the late 1850s can be paralleled with the retreat from the kind of paternalistic humanitarian confidence around the same time. As such, the status of the West India Regiment shifted from a desperate response to the revolutionary Atlantic to then being yet another non-white element within Britain's increasingly heterogeneous global armed forces. Many of the features of the steady black soldier remained, but the tropical exoticism that is still routinely signified by palm trees was also incorporated into the uniform itself, thus beginning a process by which the West India Regiments became increasingly distanced from the military spectacle of the rest of the regular British Army. It's in this exotic military spectacle that the West India Regiment forces began to operate on a more extensive scale across West Africa from the 1850s and 1860s. This included a punitive expedition on the River Gambia, for which one Samuel Hodge became the first man of African descent, soldier of African descent, soldier of African descent to win the Victoria Cross. And I can talk about this more. Yes, I think this is a conscious, though possibly unconscious, evocation of the kind of Wedgwood style, am I not a man and brother? I think that's pretty intentional here. And Hodge, despite his actions, was really kind of downplayed in the way in which this event was covered in image and in word. Even when the regiment soldiers performed acts of demonstrable, outstanding heroism, they remained marginalised, trapped by the limitations of the trope of the steady black soldier and an anomalous presence in the British Army. Moreover, amid the polarised racial dynamics of colonial warfare in late 19th century Africa, and as their rank and file became more demographically African-Caribbean, the West India regiments came to occupy a kind of uncertain middle ground between, on the one hand, the thin red line of civilised white soldiers, and on the other hand, so-called supposedly savage black warriors, the Zulu, the Ashanti. And as such, they found themselves increasingly lumped into a group of non-white British auxiliaries in contemporary writing, something that not only influenced how they were covered in the press, but also how they were used in the field. Consider, for example, the 1873-74 Anglo-Ashanti War, which was Britain's first significant military expedition into tropical Africa and the first colonial campaign to really catch the Victorian public's imagination. The expedition's military commanding officer, Garnet Joseph Wolseley, the very model of a modern Major General and the person who would go on to become the head of the British Army, was unconvinced about the martial capabilities of his West India Regiment forces. Wolseley viewed the conflict with the Ashanti Kingdom primarily as a race war, in which the Ashanti army had to be defeated and be seen to be defeated by white soldiers. As a result, the West India Regiment soldiers that had participated in the first half of the campaign prior to Wolseley's arrival found themselves increasingly marginalised, reduced to the station of baggage handlers for the white troops during the final march on Kumasi, and prohibited from entering the Ashanti capital at the climax of the war. In his history, which is this, in his history of the 2nd West India Regiment, James Caulfield recalled the discontent that he, his fellow West India Regiment officers, and the men had felt when they heard this news. Great was the disappointment felt when the news arrived that Kumasi had fallen, and the regiment, which had borne the brunt of the campaign over 8 months, were not allowed to participate in the honour of entering it. The regiment deserved better treatment than it got on this occasion. The views of a commanding officer like Wolseley, which are also evident in, guess what, his support for the Confederacy, and also he thought that emancipation was a terrible idea, had real consequences in the field. And this brings us then to the late 19th century, some 100 years after the West India Regiments had been founded. Now, by this point, there was only a single West India Regiment left, comprising of a couple of battalions. And detachment from both battalions travelled to Britain in 1897 to participate in Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Amid the array of military types from across the British Empire present, the West India Regiment found itself classified as yet another colonial unit. So this is a representation of the procession, West India Regiments there. So they're not marching with the rest of the British Army. And this is very much echoed in contemporary accounts. The Daily Mail, which had only been founded a couple of years by this point, was straight on message. And the Mail drew a distinction between British-bred colonials, Canadians, Australians especially, who were a testimony to the greatness of the British race, and native colonial troops, of which the West India Regiment were an example. So although, I mean, the 1897 Jubilee, which again I can talk about if people wish, was a very, very militarised Jubilee, really Army, Navy, especially the Army, front and centre. But it's not a kind of military logic that organises it. It's very much a kind of racial logic. And in that racial logic, the West India Regiments are kept to the back out of the way. A year after the Diamond Jubilee, the Graphic newspaper published yet another of these kind of group images of the defenders of empire. And a striking feature of this one, which does have that Sergeant Pepper's kind of feel about it, is the presence of the West India Regiment soldier front and centre. The white shirt, the yellow gold trim of the jacket makes him stand out relative to the dark, the sort of subdued blues and scarlets of the figures around him. And, particularly, the kind of three figures, European Hong Kong police, Sierra Leone Frontier Force and Malta engineers, sort of who are in dark blue, make him stand out, as well as these two, kind of the framing of him by the Trinidad Light Infantry and these two units of Canadian forces kind of frame him. Now, the central and prominent place of the West India Regiment may have been no more than an artistic choice, given the unusual nature of the Zouave uniform, though it is worth saying there are other examples of Zouave uniforms in this image, and they're completely out of the way. There's one right at the back you can barely see, and there's one off to one side. So it's, this is the only Zouave soldier in the middle. But I think there's more than just artistic choice. I think that the coverage of the West India Regiments up to and beyond the 1897 Diamond Jubilee turned on an ambivalence about their place in the British Empire and in its global military forces. That ambivalence was there from the very beginning, but I think this moment, the Diamond Jubilee, was such a kind of moment of imperial hubris, the kind of the ideological weight on this, there's so much kind of symbolic work that's going on around the Diamond Jubilee, served to clarify the place of the West India Regiments, not only in the popular imagination, but for much of the British military establishment. And it clarified it as follows. They didn't really belong in the British Army. So even though they were in the British Army, they weren't really in the British Army. And I think that's becomes really clear by this point, 1897. Some conclusions. So my central argument today has been that the image of the West India Regiments mattered. It shaped public perceptions of the societies in which they were raised and were present, and it impacted on the military uses to which they were put. In the midst of a military crisis caused by setbacks and the heavy loss of troops during the French Revolutionary War and the Haitian Revolution, the West India Regiments were created in an act of desperation. They became an anomalous presence in the British Army, what Roger Buckley famously called slaves in redcoats, and forerunners of the aliens in uniforms that were far more common by the global wars of the 20th century. These were martially hybrid figures, a focus for anxieties about their loyalty, with doubts about their military capabilities combining with fears about their prowess. For white colonists, in their early years, they were a menace, viewed with fear and hatred to be kept at distance. And as such sentiments receded over time, and particularly beyond the highly racially charged context of the Caribbean, the black soldiers were viewed as figures of mimicry, dressed in the same garb as the British regular, but not quite considered to be real soldiers. As such, the image of the West India Regiments was a contested site in what Catherine Hall calls a war of representation. Almost 30 years after the Diamond Jubilee, 20,000 people watched the final trooping of the colour by the West India Regiment at Up Park Camp in Jamaica in a ceremony described as impressive and full of pathos. The final regiment was being disbanded. Lieutenant Colonel W. Miller, its most recent commander, requested that the regimental colours be presented to George V and deposited at Windsor Castle. The War Office agreed, but it refused to pay for any travel back to the Caribbean afterwards. As a result, no African Caribbean personnel could accompany the colours, which were instead taken by 7 white British officers and warrant officers who were returning home. Most went straight on leave, leaving Miller little time to pull together a reasonably sized party of men with varying degrees of association with the West India Regiment. The presentational party was received at Buckingham Palace with no ceremony, other than brief thanks from George V, who acknowledged a fine record of gallantry under the most arduous conditions. The scene was poignant not for what occurred at the palace, which the whole thing took no more than 20 minutes, but for how little ceremony there was, and of course because of who was not there. Of the men who made up the regiment, whose predecessors had been responsible for these various battle honours, there was no sign whatever. In short, from the beginning to the end, they remained soldiers of uncertain rank. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, David, for that really, really brilliant lecture. It's incredibly stimulating. I'm sure I have lots of questions. I'm sure you do as well. We have time to entertain as many as we can accommodate while we have the room for the next 45 minutes. So if you indicate by a show of hands, if you wish to ask David a question, please raise your hand. We have one microphone, but I think if we speak loudly, we can get you in. Yes.
I can just speak very loudly. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I'm a secondary school history teacher, so I'm not going to be speaking from a position of much detailed knowledge. But I would be quite interested to know, you mentioned the popular understandings of it within British society in the 19th century. Were there any interesting or quite engaging sources you've come across within Britain of their understanding, popular understandings of this regiment? Were they known about widely, do you feel, or do you think it was just within the kind of military society?
Thank you very much. So that's a great question. So the question about the kind of popular knowledge and understanding of the West India Regiments in the 19th century, I think that's one of the things that men like people like Ellis and Caulfield, some of these kind of senior officers, decry, because the way things work with the West India Regiments is they move essentially between postings in the Caribbean and West Africa, and they're on a kind of rotation. And so do the officers. So unless the officers are on leave. So they're actually very rarely seen in Britain. I've not done any work. It would be an interesting thing to find out, for example, the records of Hythe Military School of Musketry, whether there is any kind of records on local accounts in Hythe. That would be a really interesting question. There's an account from the late, I think it's maybe 1895, 96, where I think it's about then, where a 3rd battalion that's briefly raised is passing through, I want to say Portsmouth, and the press coverage sort of says people should go down and look at this because it's interesting. It's like a novelty. But most of the things you get are, you don't really get much more than that. Now, having said that, there are, for example, there are toy soldiers in this style. There are, one of the handy things about the fact that the Zouave uniform is adopted is that gives you a Z. So there are kind of like popular primers, like A to Z of the British Army kind of thing. And when you're like, it's like you play that game with your kids where you go like animals beginning with letter X, and it's like always X-ray fish or something because there basically aren't any. Oh, we've got Z for Zouave. So there's a bunch of kind of like sort of A to Z type things where the Zouave will be at the end, and sometimes it is the West India Regiment soldier rather than, say, a French soldier. So you get it in that kind of literature that's more aimed at sort of juvenile, like that sort of thing. There's also, there are also some evidence of other forms of material culture. So, for example, like toy dolls in the Zouave uniform. Most of it dates from this later period because this is seen as exotic and interesting. I've not come across any sort of earlier images. There's also, if you look at, for example, this action here, Samuel Hodge, this is a pretty minor, relatively minor military excursion, but it leads to this, as I say, this Victoria Cross. That gets a lot of attention because the award, this is not that long after the Victoria Cross had become a thing, and there's a general attention. And this painting gets produced and probably did get displayed with other paintings of Victoria Cross winners. So that would speak probably more to a kind of like middle class audience, that people would go and look. There's a great deal of interest, particularly in the artist who creates this painting and the other ones he does. It gets displayed at like the Alexander Palace, at the Crystal Palace, that kind of thing. It goes on tour around the empire. So you get that kind of thing. But in terms of like what people thought about this stuff, not really very much, to be honest. But it's a great question, thank you.
Gad?
David, thanks very much. In that early period, you described how Colin saw the West India Regiments as dangerous,
Yep.
problematical. But they also must have seen them as significant militarily at the same time, as well as demographically significant. So is it possible they could reconcile those two views, or if so, how?
Okay, thanks, Gad. So that, I mean, first of all, it's people in general, and you know, can hold contradictory views. I mean, the white West Indians said certain things about non-white people, which at the same time seemed to coexist with them, relying on them to raise their children, and also so contradiction could happen. But I think the arming of enslaved people, as I said in the talk, is not an uncommon practice. So, for example, you know, the idea of black shot, as often called, so the kind of the raising of temporary units, planters often saying, right, there's something's happening, I'm going to rely on probably some of my drivers, some of the other kind of more favoured enslaved people on the estate, the stronger men, quickly arming them. That's very common. And you see all sorts of forms of, I mean, that happens during tackies. The white planters or enslavers are raising enslaved people to fight against, and that sort of thing. And that happens across all as far back as, I mean, the War of Jenkins' Ear, people are doing that, as well as in the 7 Years' War and so forth. So that's very common. The difference is, I think, that kind of black shot model is under the control of the planters. It's under the control of the enslavers, whereas this lot are under the control of the War Office. And, you know, there's a lot of pushback in Jamaica in the early years about a regiment even being brought to Jamaica. You know, and it's only when the kind of British government starts talking about, well, you know, financial questions start getting raised, and it escalates quite quickly. So I don't think these people, I think these people would recognise the value of arming men of African descent to defend them, but they didn't want the men armed in this way. They wanted them under their control, ones that they could reward with manumission, for example, at the end of the process. Rather than having something that is essentially outside their control.
We wait for another question. Maybe I could ask a quick follow-up question to the first one, David, if you don't mind. I'm very curious about the way in which some of these images make their way back to the Caribbean, and if you're able to detect that in maybe travelers' accounts, other forms of sources, including material culture and visual culture.
That's a great question. I mean, you see, I would say by the 1860s, so partly to do with the kind of increasing routinization of travel as travel to the Caribbean for leisure, and also to do, I think, heightened by the kind of ideological dimensions of the American Civil War. You see travellers who will talk about the presence of West India Regiment forces in the Caribbean and then talk about it as significant. And there are kind of a whole series of, there are images, including photographs, and I had a former PhD student of mine, Melissa Bennett, whose thesis was about this, where people will take photographs and in the same way you might have a palm tree in them, you might have a West India Regiment soldier to denote the Caribbean. So the Zouave uniform becomes that thing, and the way which people talk about this, they sort of, for some British travellers, it's seen as that they have successfully civilised. It's a kind of it's a mark of the success of the civilising project, embodied in that figure. Often drawing a contrast with the kind of the chaos and the violence of the American Civil War, that we got emancipation for some, that we got emancipation right. This is the demonstration of that. We're not doing it the way the Americans are. So I think there's some that you see that kind of thing. There's also, I mean, again with something like with Hodge, because this is like quite a significant figure. There are there are accounts of how because he back to the Caribbean after this, and it doesn't live that much longer. He dies quite quickly, and that's definitely caught within the kind of in the Caribbean. That's seen as a significant his death, what he'd done. There's a kind of that registers in kind of popular culture, not much, but it does. And then of course if you go a few years forward. Again, I mean, various people, Mimi Scheller, Melissa Bennett, others have worked on the kind of the photographic archive associated with Morant Bay, and West India Regiment soldiers feature reasonably prominently there. Not quite as prominently as the Maroons, but that idea of kind of, you know, when people are buying those photographs of the dead, the white dead, you know, those ones that people collect after Morant Bay, West India Regiment soldiers are in there, including, of course, some of the key officers. So that clearly takes on a kind of collecting culture within that post-Morant Bay moment. Yeah. Is that fair, Liz?
Yeah.
Do you think? Yeah?
Sure.
I want to talk about the music, because you mentioned the kind of the band figure and the drummer.
Yeah.
And that kind of, the WRR band becomes quite a big kind of entity in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
You know, plays at Myrtle Bank Hotel. So I wondered if that also translates across, particularly to the British Imperial culture.
Not directly. I mean, obviously, you describe those kind of the presence of the band within. Well, no, that's not true. So you can track the times when the West India Regiment band does come across. It performs, I think, at the 1884 Imperial exposition, whatever that one. I think it's 1884. They're present for that. They tour a bit. I'm sure I've read about them being in Canada. They are in the run-up. You know, the year before the Diamond Jubilee, the band again is present for there's something called the Sons of Empire, which is this kind of like almost like proto-Jubilee thing, which I think starts in, I want to say, 94, 95, and both soldiers and the band are often involved in that. So as part of those like military tattoo type things. So that's not you definitely get that. And then you also get I've seen sheet music, that sort of the kind of Zouave march, which features West India Regiment imagery. Although it doesn't, I've not seen the actual music itself, so I don't know if I don't think it's tunes associated with. But there's also, and it's not something I've done much work on, but it's really interesting. There's definitely, you can see in the late 1850s, early 1860s, you can see in newspapers adverts for costumes. West India Regiment costumes, Zuzu costumes, and it's French and British West India Regiment that people are dressing up going to balls. It becomes one of the things that you go as, which is not a kind of music dimension, but I suppose it is to do with the kind of like sort of like more popular performance of that. And of course, they're not officer uniforms. They are, you know, they are kind of bandsman type uniforms. It's kind of probably how people thought about them. So yeah.
Thanks for that too, David.
Thanks, Isaac.
I wanted to ask, you mentioned earlier that the image of the black soldier was kind of an affront to slave society in the Caribbean, particularly in Jamaica. I know the Carolina Corps, when they were brought to the Caribbean, they were originally, they had a unit of dragoons, and they were dismounted in Jamaica. And the original plan for raising the West India Regiments, they wanted mounted dragoons as well. I wondered if that, you know, the perception of a black soldier on a horse would have been threatening, and that was part of the reason why those ideas were dropped.
Completely. That's a great question. Totally. I mean, if you think about, I talked about other images circulating at the time of armed black men. One of the most famous ones from this time is Toussaint on his horse. I mean, that is a radical image. You know, I've done a little bit of work on kind of horses and their kind of symbolic significance, you know, where, you know, white visitors to Jamaica and elsewhere being described as ekibekis because they're walking around rather than riding a horse. So that's a deeply, deeply powerful image of a figure on a horse, and that would unimaginably too far. So yes, deeply threatening figure, the idea of, and that's both because of the horses themselves as force multipliers, if you want to be like military about it, but just as symbolically, it's a great question. Yeah, that would be unconscionable. Even though, the arguments are made, well, cavalry's not as useful in the Caribbean and stuff like that, but you can find uses for cavalry because people ride around them catching enslaved people, so they're clearly pretty useful. The Maréchaussée of Saint-Domingue and stuff. So, yeah, that's definitely that's beyond the pale as a kind of threatening image.
Thank you, David. I just have a question.
Hello, I didn't see you. Hiya.
I just have a question about, because I was very struck by what you were saying about the static soldiering body.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, the proponents of the steady black soldier,
Yeah.
do you see examples of people speaking specifically to that context of the immobile, well, supposedly immobile civilian post-emancipation body? Like, so in terms of that, are people claiming that that's doing something in terms of all of that discourse around indolence in the Caribbean and workers needing to kind of
Ooh, that's a great question. I mean, the steady black soldier is definitely not an indolent figure. This is definitely someone stood to attention. There's some interesting kind of exchanges that take place around, I think in 1802, 1803, some of the material that's in the National Army Museum, where they talk about some soldiers of the West India Regiment carrying their rifles on the shoulders like that as they walk around, sometimes with their boots hanging off the back of the musket, and that gets a lot. That seems to really. They come down very hard on that because I think there's a kind of a desire to. That's seen as very unsoldierly, and I think that speaks to the idea that these black bodies have to be disciplined and be seen to be disciplined. In terms of how that then plays into ideas around sort of ideas around indolence and freedom in the post-emancipation period. I mean, for the people who, I mean, as I say, the kind of I'd say from the late 1830s, so basically post-emancipation, there is generally, I think, something of a shift to a more positive evaluation of the West India Regiments. They are seen as a kind of bulwark against the newly freed formerly enslaved people and the dangers for social control. And I think that idea that these are almost the West India Regiment soldiers, that when people talk about them standing there, talking about themselves as the king's gentlemen or the queen's gentlemen, and this kind of, I think this is seen as a kind of a counterpoint to the dangers of freedom as indolence. They may be static, but it's a purposeful stasis rather than a kind of, it's not, I don't think Carlyle doesn't talk about the West India Regiments. I don't think Trollope has much to say about them either, to be honest, which is kind of interesting. But I would imagine that for both of them, they would see these are a counterpoint to that kind of thing, which is why you get, there are certain colonies, Trinidad being one, where there's a question about settling former West India Regiment soldiers, like retired soldiers, and the idea of bringing them in, because they're, in some places in Trinidad, they're seen as a kind of ideal, a good type of form of labour, and often they end up in police forces and stuff like that. So again, they're seen as a kind of idea, they're disciplined people. And that's why a lot of there's around Morant Bay, there's a kind of drawing of breath, what will they do? And of course, when the soldiers do their duty, in inverted commas, that's seen as demonstrating the success of this in the Caribbean, that this project has worked. That doesn't mean that they're seen as having any military value in the West, in Africa, as people like Wosley will say, and that's partly, anyway, that's a whole other thing, but that's a great question about, this isn't indolent figures, these are purposefully still figures, I think it's what they do, with bearing and deportment. I think there's I don't know.
Thanks, David.
I think there was one, two.
So, thank you. Just a quick question. I wondered if you knew if there's any comparative studies being done of the equivalent of the West India Regiment through the other major European nations. So what was happening at the time? You mentioned the French, the Spanish and so on, because increasingly people like me don't want breakdowns of my history by a European national framework.
Yeah.
We want to look across, because I say to myself, I could have, more relatives in Brazil, perhaps, than I could in Dominica, where I was born. Just because that had a French flag for most of it doesn't mean that, I don't have connections elsewhere.
Yep.
So I want to read about those connections in the history. I don't want just what happened to in British colonies, because that in itself underpins the kind of oppression. So, yeah, whether or not you know of any other similar studies being done, but taking it across, looking at the people across, rather than divided it into European nation. I think I'm making...
Yeah, you have completely perfect sense. So I think there's a couple of things to say. There's a great book, Arming Slaves, which essentially is a series of chapters that looks at different forms of this practice in the Caribbean. I think there's a chapter in Brazil in there, and then in North America. It is comparative. In other words, each chapter looks at a different time and place, because obviously these are armies, so they are organised imperially. I mean, that's just how they are. This is, there isn't any traffic backwards and forwards between the French army and the Spanish army. They're different national things. But that book is really good because I think it offers, and the chapters are written in conversation with one another, so you can sort of see the similarities, the differences. There's quite a lot of work that's been done on the Trier, the kind of French soldiers, both in kind of West Africa and in North Africa. Some really good work, and I'm happy to, if you send me an email, I can suggest some stuff. There's also a really interesting thing that, Isaac and I were talking about this. Tell us about the Bourbon Regiment, because I know this is something you've been working on, because this actually speaks to the kind of cross connections that you're talking about.
Yeah, there was a regiment of enslaved soldiers raised by the French in an island called Bourbon in the Indian Ocean, just next to what is now Mauritius. So when the British conquered the island, they eventually moved those soldiers from there and brought them to Barbados. And it's those soldiers that they used to repress the 1816 Buses rebellion. So yeah, everyone was kind of doing the same thing in a way.
So the lives of those men specifically do that cross. They themselves are not constrained by... They find themselves enrolled in two different armies, but their lives are bigger than that. I suppose that's why that's an interesting example. There's also... there's a lot of really good work on, because the kind of the way in which, let's say, systems of slavery and systems of raising soldiers, that's not limited to the French or the Spanish or the British. Lots of people have done that in different places. The Spanish one is interesting. They often use these kind of auxiliary, they call them like auxiliary troops essentially, and the lives of those men. So there's a really interesting group essentially of, it's a fascinating story, which is to do with the early years of the Haitian Revolution, where you've got French-speaking enslaved men of African descent who rise up, take up arms, and end up sort of being supported by the Spanish, though they're basically operating independently, and eventually being taken. The Spanish kind of evacuate them, and they end up in other places, and their lives are really complicated, and they are not constrained in any way. They are fighting in different ways for different people, usually for themselves. So their lives themselves speak to sort of something that's not constrained by European categories.
I'm interested in the
presumably most of these images come from colonial white people who have drawn and painted them. And are there these kinds of, well, not exactly, obviously they'd be very different, but are there images of, say, the regiments or people that come from countries, the different Caribbean countries that they are talking about?
Yeah, of course. So there's a question about.
Sorry, is that?
No, it's quite all right. It's just because I've got the microphone, so it's easier for me to. No, it's fine. So you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of these images. We don't know enough about them, but we know some things about them to know that these are images that were like that painting, the origins of that engraving, that image too, were based on sketches from life. So they were done by people in the Caribbean, and we can sort of see who those people were, and they're primarily kind of like this guy here. So the man who created the original sketch that turns into this, Charles Hamilton Smith, he's a military engineer. He's also a naturalist. He produces a lot of images of kind of plants and animals. Who's kind of interested in collecting things, and he produces a whole book of images of like there are lots of like the Royal Guards, the 14th Fusiliers. There are like white soldiers as well. The East India Company sepoys are in this. There's a whole bunch of things. The West India Regiments just happens to be one page. So this is an image on the ground by a visitor. There are also some images. I haven't included any here, for which I apologise. There is I'm aware of at least one painting, which is kind of quite a simple, clearly not by someone who's trained, which is of a West India Regiment soldier, possibly a self-portrait, possibly a portrait of someone. There's a particularly famous, so there are a few images, and it's sort of like, as I say, not a trained painter, but clearly someone who was interested in doing that. That's the only one I can think that might be a kind of self-portrait. But then some of these other images. I mean, one of the things you see is how certain sort of tropes get reproduced. I mean, that is an image that's taken from life. I mean, they're two real men, but that would have been by a British artist initially, which then turns into an engraving. And then images like there's a particular military artist called Richard Simkin, who's very common, produces a lot of these kind of things. Some of these would have been just based on like what you thought an image, like descriptions of uniforms. And then if we take this one, which is kind of an interesting one, this is the artist who created this painting either met or had a photograph of the white guy. He never met Hodge. And Hodge is, in this painting, that kind of part of one of the things I was trying to, sort of the painting illustrates that this is a, he's almost featureless. This painting is all about him, the white guy who didn't win the Victoria Cross. But there aren't any, and there are some really interesting images, much more contemporary images. So, for example, there's an image where this military event appears on a stamp from, I think, the year 2000, Caribbean stamp, and it portrays this incident in an entirely different way, and there's no white person in it, and the black soldiers are actually doing something, but that's a much more contemporary image. But yeah, in the main, in terms of materials that have survived, these are primarily images of these people rather than by these people, that's the pattern in general, to be frank.
Can I ask David just another question stirred by that one, which is just thinking about the reception of these images by black audiences. Mm-hmm. I wonder how much these images factored into a notion of quote-unquote sort of British civilization that should be emanated or emulated from based on how the images portray, but also sort of black relationships to the military. We know for by the time you get to the First World War, there is this huge volunteerism on the part of Caribbean people to enlist and to support the British Army. And I wonder if you can connect these various threads that you're presented to us with this elevation of that role. And again, even just the uniform, right? The army always being this vehicle through which you can actually get the uniform, get respectability, all of those sorts of things that are attached to a colonial society.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, by the time of the First World War, and this is something that Michael Joseph has talked about, by the time of the First World War, the West India Regiments don't have a very good reputation in the Caribbean. And that's partly because, I mean, in some ways, lots of military units don't generally, because, if you've got to think, so who joins the army? This is basically, the army's seen as the place where, working class guys who haven't got many other options join. They go into the army, which is still the case. That's very common. That's how most of the armies recruit. Whereas, for example, the new units that are created in the First World War, the British West Indies Regiment, is like a conduit for middle class volunteerism, and that's very much tied into certain ideas around kind of like demonstrating patriotism, but also, of course, ultimately trying to seek change at home, and you know that story. Whereas the West India Regiment, there aren't those middle-class Jamaicans or the lower to middle-class Jamaicans who they're not joining the West India Regiment. That's basically, it's not quite Wellington's scum of the earth, but they don't have much of a reputation. And I think that there's also something to say here about the relationship between, for example, the military and civil forces, like the police. You get all sorts of accounts of kind of fights and trouble and things like that, which again wouldn't necessarily. And then the other thing, of course, is that after Morant Bay, one of the things the British realised they should have been doing, and surprisingly they hadn't, because that's basically what all empires do, is a lot of the soldiers who were involved in violently suppressing the Morant Bay Rebellion from amongst the West India Regiments are Jamaicans, and they realised that's a dangerous thing to do. So they start putting Bajans in Jamaica and Jamaicans in Barbados, etc. They move them around. So in some ways, the West India Regiment over time comes to have less connection to the people the actual community where they serve. They're from somewhere else, which is what empires do. Whereas the West Indies Regiment that's founded is very much, has that much more organic connection. That kind of, which is similar to lots of other kind of, what do they call them, PALS units and stuff that get founded in Britain as well, where people collectively, driven by some sense of duty or service, get together to do this thing, which is very, very different, I think. Thanks, Matt.
Minty?
Thank you. It was a really interesting talk. I was just wondering, obviously, skin colour has been something really historically and culturally significant in the Caribbean, and I was wondering how variations of skin colour played out in depictions of West India Regiment soldiers, because as you said, they were kind of depicted as the racial other, as the black steady soldier, but how for example were mixed race Caribbeans, were they depicted the same way? Were they also presented in
That's a really interesting question. So I'm not sure I have an overall answer, but I'll tackle it two ways. The first one is that, so when the regiments are first founded, the British Army's plan is that they're going to raise the regiments. I mean, there are some existing units who they kind of sort of roll in, but they have a plan of one, basically free volunteers. So they have this idea that free non-white people will volunteer to serve in the British Army. Guess what? They don't. Secondly, they have this idea that they'll be able to buy enslaved people from planters. The British Army basically wants healthy, fit ones. Well, if you're an enslaver, they're the people you want working for you, so they don't sell them. and there's also like hostility and opposition to that plan. So they end up essentially buying enslaved people from the people who trade in enslaved African men, women, and children. In other words, they're Africans. So early on, these are African men from different parts of Africa who were in these regiments. They're not African Caribbean men, and therefore, it's primarily they're not of mixed race. So in some way, and they're represented as such. They're represented as Africans. And then, if we kind of go forward, so as I've sort of said a number of times, obviously I've been primarily talking about the image of the rank and file. The officers are white, and there is no, I mean, early on, the kind of initial, when they first sort of established the regiments, a lot of the sergeants are like, they bring people in from other regiments, and there's a lot of Irish soldiers who are the sergeants. But over time, those non-commissioned officers also start, people rise up the ranks, and there's those kind of roles are kind of black sergeants is a really interesting role, somewhat parallel to like things like we talked about like drivers and things like that. These like groups who are in the middle. Sergeants are like really important in how like a military works, but they can never rise any further. So there are no black officers ever, and it's only right at the end. There's a photograph that Melissa Bennett found, which is from the late 19th century, which is probably of an officer of mixed European African ancestry. But that's basically the only one we found. And so, there does seem to be at some point some kind of movement. But I mean, soldiers don't rise up the ranks. You don't become an officer. It's very, very rare. You buy in from outside. So who that man was, how he came from outside. So in other words, this is primarily, the regiments are primarily black and white, at least until, until maybe into the second half of the 19th century, and are kind of represented in that kind of way of these kind of like that dualism. So that's quite different, for example, to, I don't know, thinking about images associated with the Jean de Couleur, the kind of André Rigaud, or those kind of like the Francophone soldiers who'd fought in the American War of Independence and who end up becoming significant players in the early stages, especially of the Haitian Revolution, who have like military experience and who are manning the militias. They're basically like two-thirds of the militias are basically these people. You don't get that in the West India Regiment. You would have militia men who would be of free non-white people, but they're not. They're different from the regiments, obviously, because they're militia, colonial militia. That's a great question. Thank you.
And a great way to end.
I'll come to it in a second.
And if anyone has any further questions, I'm sure
yeah.
might be willing to entertain.
Of course, yeah.
But please, let's give David another round.